And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 159. If you're looking to improve your understanding of photography, well then you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you click like, make sure you click the little notification bell if you do subscribe. And if you happen to be watching live, then leave a comment. Let me know who you are, where you are, what the weather's doing, and join in the chat. Well, I can see we've got a few regulars here. They're a friendly bunch. Become one of them, why not? And if you enjoy this, then tell your friends. And don't forget, there's 158 previous episodes to dive into as well, all recorded here on this YouTube channel. So, with that, yes, today I'm going to be talking about the idea of making your photos a bit more cinematic. Now, primarily I'm going to be looking at the notion of crop, but also other things will turn up on the way. So I hope you'll enjoy this one. Yes, so welcome. I see we've got a couple of comments in already. Maggie says, good afternoon, dull and a bit chilly here in Castle Douglas today. And it is. Considering it is the beginning of July, I went out for my walk today and I had several layers on. It's not feeling like July, that's for sure. Robert says, howdy all from a nice cool Texas. Cool for once, right, okay. Oh, Robert, by the way, I did send a reply to your email and I sent you a nudge with a message via Messenger as well. So do check your messages for that one. Susan says, hi from Kakubri, where we've got typical summer weather, sunshine and showers. Oh, Kakubri is only 9 miles down the road. We've not actually had the showers today here in Castle Douglas, but although it keeps looking like it's threatening to. John says, good afternoon from a sunny Essex. Sandra says, hi everyone from an overcast but warm Birmingham. And John Harvey says, hello from a wet Columbus, Ohio. Right, okay, so we have people. I have photos to show you. I have a theme to talk about. Also, on top of that, we also have two people, Robert and Sandra, have both sent in images for critique. So I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But I'm going to start off with the idea of cinematic. And what do I mean by the notion of cinematic photography? Well, primarily it comes down to the notion of kind of crop ratios as such. So what I think probably, Rosemary's joined us as well, says, lovely to see everyone. Rosemary's over in the Pacific Northwest USA. So what I'm going to do, I think, is probably the best thing to do is to talk about the notion of, I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to give you some numbers first. Don't worry, if you love numbers, you'll love this. If you don't love numbers, then don't worry, just try and get the general concept of what I'm talking about, and you can always look up the numbers afterwards. So what I'm going to talk about then is the notion of crop ratios and the way that images can appear on the screen. Now, I've done particular episodes specifically on cropping before now, but in a way, we're going to kind of specialise a little bit more. So, let me flip over. Now, this is a photo that I created, some of you will have seen this before, for a band called Cafe Largo a few years back. Now, when I created this photo, this is the way it was created to this ratio, to this size. There's a bigger border around it than I would note that was used for the way it was publicly, but I deliberately created a bigger border around it so that I could crop it at different ratios to allow for different levels of use of the photo. And there is this thing that if you are ever in a position whereby you are essentially commercially doing photography, as in your photography, whether you're being paid or not, but it's that notion that your photography is going beyond just the person, just yourself, then somebody else is going to be looking at it, and maybe somebody else beyond that somebody else is going to be looking at it. So in this case, it wasn't just a case of this photo was for me, or this photo was even for the band. This photo was for the people who were going to be, who the band was aiming at, the band's potential clients, whether that was booking agents or venues or people who would pay at the door to come and see them. So given that, this picture could appear on websites, could appear on Instagram, could appear on social media platforms, or is a poster, or on ticket stubs, or in brochures, then it needed to have a flexibility about it. So when you're kind of designing a photo like that, generally speaking, you take the photo bigger than it needs to be so that you have options in the cropping. Now, with that in mind, generally speaking, this would have, if I just zoom in a little bit, perhaps it would have more commonly been sort of seen something like that. Now, straight out the camera, most people's camera have a 3:2 ratio, so, or a 1 to 1.5 almost, I suppose. There's different ways you can talk about it, but if you say a 1 to 1.5, and that means, well, let me show you. If I take this photo, and let's just open this with Photoshop for a moment, and what this means is, if I, so let me take this, I'm just going to drag that over a little bit that way so that my picture in the corner isn't interfering with the photo that's going on here. But if I go up to image size, the image size here, we can see in pixels is 5050 pixels across by 3000 wide. Well, what does that mean? That means if I change the height to 1000 pixels, what we see is the width is 1500. Okay, so the width is half as big again as the height. So a ratio of 1 to 1.5, 1 to 1.5. Okay, that's what that ratio gives you. And that is a fairly standard out of the camera. Most cameras tend to work at that kind of ratio. You might find you've got 4000 pixels high by 6000 pixels across, or, you know, and it's or some kind of variation. If you take one number and you divide it into the other, then you'll end up with that kind of ratio. So that's all very well. However, if you think about then Instagram is square, and there's quite a lot of formats which have square formats. Now, what square is a ratio of 1 to 1. So if what I do is, let me just create a new little file here, and what I will do is I will create it as 1000 pixels, sorry, wrong button there, by 1000 pixels. So 1000 by 1000 will give us a square crop. Now, if I select all, copy that, paste that onto here, I'll select T, and then that means if I drag one of these, it keeps the same ratio aspect. I pull that down, pull that here, and then reduce the opacity so we can see through it and get a sense of. Then this is the size it will be. So then I can slide this left and right until I go, okay, where do I want that? Now, it doesn't look like with a square crop I'm going to be able to get, if I try and get the plant in on the right, then I move, then I lose half the dancer over on the left. The dancer is more important than the plant, so I can kind of try and squeeze that in. I lose her heel if I want to get the edge. Actually, the whole thing doesn't properly work. So if I really line that up properly there, sort of maybe if I just try and get the edge of her heel with the edge of the drum stand there, and then if I was to go to crop, I'll just bring that into there, enter, remove that. And now we have a square crop version of this. Now, it looks a little bit odd because there's a bit of plant hanging out that we don't have any context for. So probably what I would then do is I would remove that bit in Photoshop just because it doesn't really fit in with the square ratio of it. Okay, so that's what a square crop is. So this is what happens is quite often you design a picture for one look, and certainly if generally speaking the way this one tended to go was, in fact, if I hold down the shift button when I do that, that keeps the ratio there as well. I might have more commonly kind of been seen and printed like that. Okay, but like I say, I left a bigger space to allow for alternate crops. So square was one of them. It's not ideal, but you can get away with it. But your computer screen, most people's computer screen these days, or your TV, most people's TV, if you think, I mean, most of us when we were younger had TVs which had a slightly squarer ratio, more kind of 4 to 5. It wasn't, a 1 to 1.2 or 1 to 1.25 or something, where it wasn't much wider than it was square. And we know when we watch some of these old TV programs that get repeated, on our side of our screen there's these big black strips, or the picture gets stretched into weird proportions. So what we're talking about is the fact that TVs used to be squarer, but these days most TVs, it used to be called widescreen TVs, now they're just known as TVs, tend to have a ratio of 16 to 9, or on computer screen quite often that's 1080 pixels high by 1920 pixels across. If you're ever playing around with pixel size, that tends to be a standard ratio. This screen that you're watching on YouTube has exactly that same ratio. And that ratio, which is, so if I go to File, New, and let's type in that ratio. So let's say I had the 1080 to 1920, and I create that. That gives us this shape. Now, what I'll also do, just to I change the image size here, and actually now we've got that ratio, I'll change that to 1000. Then what we find is the width equivalent is 1778. Okay, so for the same amount of height, you get more width. So you get this more landscape thing. So this is really what our TV screen's like. Now, if I copy that and go and place that on here, and then stretch that out like that, we can see it's still not as big. It's now, we're not as bad as we were with the square, but now we've lost some of the top and we've lost some of the bottom. So if this was to appear filling up a TV screen, we now have to kind of readjust. Where do we want it? Dead center is like that. Is that quite right? It feels a little bit like there's a little bit too much below, not quite enough on top. I might just raise that a little bit there. So if I was trying to get this picture to fit comfortably in this ratio, then that's probably what I would do, is sort of just take a little bit off the top, a little bit more off the bottom, hit enter, and now we've got a widescreen TV or computer screen version of this image. And, it doesn't look too bad. I think, we're starting to lose some of these reflections which are in the wet sand, which was part of the design of the photo, but overall, I think we can kind of get away with it. So that then is that's the kind of standard TV thing. Now, cinema went wider, and there are two standard cinema widths, neither of which roll off the tongue particularly easily. One of them is a ratio of 1 to 1.851, and that gives us a wider screen. So let me show you that one then. So now if I go to File, New, and again, so we can get that 1000 to, now I had to note that one down, 1851. So the bigger this one is getting, the bigger the width is getting, the wider it's getting in proportion to the height. So I now create that, select all, copy, paste that onto our Cafe Largo thing, and keeping the same ratio, stretch this out. Then what we find is, if I reduce the opacity for that, go to crop. Now, not crop yet. What I will do is, again, I need to move this up a little bit more, something like that, and not dissimilar. In fact, actually, yeah, no, the other one is slightly bigger. We've got a little bit more over. If I reduce that, you can see the ratio on the one below. Hold on a sec. Right, that's the ratio of this one, this ratio. I will tell you what, I need to kind of change the colour, I think. Let's do that. I'll tell you, just so you can kind of see that if I coloured in that one black, you can see we've got a thicker bar. So this new one is narrower than the previous one. So I can now take this and I can adjust this up and down, but it's not wildly out, so I can still kind of end up with something which I can get by with. Now, let's try the other one. So now the other standard cinema size is a ratio of 1 to 2391. So it's more than double the length than it is the height. Now, if I go to File, New, and what we will do now is create a 1 to 2391. Okay, create. Now you can see it's much more letterbox, okay? And this is where you would go for the big widescreen full cinema experience. And when I take that and I drag this across like this, now we can see in order to fit everything in, see if I just go for the middle here, we've actually lost the top of the shaker. We're clipping the top of his head. It's not really working. So again, I need to pull this up. If I go too high, I start losing bits off the bottom. So I'm trying to find a balance, probably around there, I would say. And then if I crop that and get rid of that, now we've got that much more widescreen cinematic look to it. And another little trick that sometimes happens is what people will do is if they're putting a picture on the internet, I've seen this done several times, and they've created this crop, but you still want to make it fit on an ordinary computer screen. If what I then do is go back to, I think it was this one, which is the let me just double check, image size, yeah, the 1:178. So I'll copy that, come back to here, paste that, Control T, and now you can see that this ends up bigger than the original. So now what I can do is when I come to here, if I stretch that up and down to there, but what I'll do is I'll make sure the background is black. So when I crop like that, now when I remove that, we can see this black line, the black bars above and below. So the outer side of this is now your standard computer screen, but the inside is that cinematic ratio. So if you wanted to have a black lines along the background, that's one of the things you can do. Otherwise, if you just want to have it straightforward, then that there is your cinematic ratio. So that's the kind of starting point I wanted to show you with that. Let me close that. Right, I can see, Janet's joined us, says, hi from a hot and humid Mrs. Alga. I just haven't worked out how to pronounce that one. But in Canada. Hot and humid in Ontario at the moment. Well, I guess that means you're back from your trip over to the Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, was it? Can't remember. I'm fairly certain you were over on the East Coast recently. Hope that went well. Right, okay, so what we see then is that notion that when we go widescreen, it makes it look that much more cinematic. And that's all very well, but it doesn't necessarily work with every photo. Even photos which might have been designed to look a bit more cinematic. So, for example, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a few different photos and talk through about the kind of photo that will work and the ones that are maybe less likely to work. So let me take, for example, then, if we take, here's a photo I did several years ago now, and was one of the first photos I did which I felt genuinely kind of cinematic, in the way that of a kind of film noir photo. And the thing with the film noir, so it's got all that kind of femme fatale, moody, shadowy lighting. There's a dead body reflected in the mirror in the background. There's a whole sense of mystery going on. And this was a photo I was really pleased with. But what we can see is it's designed to be in that normal, straight out the camera ratio. So if I open this one in Photoshop, let's close Cafe Largo for the moment, and I go to image size, we've got a ratio here, which if I change that height to from 1000, the width is 1511. So almost exactly 1500. So I might have just cropped something off the edge here somewhere. But basically that's a ratio of 1 to 1.5 again. Okay. Now, what happens if I go full widescreen cinematic? If I copy that and then paste it on here, then what we find is I'm going to lose quite a bit of the top and bottom of it. And so if I mean, for example, down the bottom here, we have an ashtray with cigarettes in. We've got a picture of a saint. We've got candle, but obviously I can't crop it there because then we'd miss out half the the people. We need the eyes and stuff. We're also then going to miss out on the cross hanging up on the top there. But if I come up this height, the whole thing doesn't really work either. In the end, the key part of the story is the face looking at us and the action that's happened in the mirror behind. So if I really want to include those bits of narrative, I've got to get them in here. But I've got to be careful where I crop. I don't want to crop just at the top of the dress. You want to make sure there's a bit of the dress in. You don't want to crop the tip of the head. You either have to come down to make sure it's definitely not on the line, or you have to just get above. So in the end, it will be somewhere around there, I reckon. And then if I crop that, this now gives us our cinematic look. And it's kind of okay, but I've lost various bits. I've lost that cross up on the top. I've lost the stuff that was going on underneath the mirror. The candle here doesn't quite look right. We've got this candle, but then we've just got the tip of the candle over on the right. The balance has kind of been thrown out. So even though in its own right, when we've got the whole photo has that kind of nice film noir, it's got a lovely kind of flow where we kind of come up the arm, around the head, through the eyes, curve around the mirror. Overall, the composition of this is one that I was always very pleased with. But when we go to full cinematic, you've got something there, but it just doesn't have the same level of impact. And this becomes important. It means that while you can make something look like a widescreen cinematic crop, the cinematic crop in itself doesn't necessarily fit every single photo. And that's a kind of really important part of this. So let's think about other possible photos. Now, the thing is with this is that at this point, sometimes what happens best is there are certain photos. Well, what you can do is you can start to, there are certain photos that I've done more recently, which are kind of been designed to be more cinematic. So if we take something like this one, so this photo has already got a slightly movie feel to it. And that what I've done with the ratio of this one is that 1:1,778, which is the widescreen TV. Okay, so I deliberately designed this one so that it would fit into widescreen TV. Now, if I put this one into Photoshop and we take that same widescreen ratio, then I'm going to struggle a little bit here, where I end up taking off. I don't want to cut her head off, obviously. If I bring it up too high, this kind of feels, so I end up I want to get part of this arm, I want this dashboard. Very important that we get the reflection in the rear view mirror. But in order to get that kind of where I want it, I end up chopping the tip of her head off, which is I'll maybe allow myself that. But it's, we're running close. And this is the thing you'll very often find with these kind of very widescreen formats, that, there is more bits are sort of cut off at the shoulder and the head. And I've got to be careful here as well that I've still got a bit of the dress showing, because if I cut it just above the neck, you wouldn't be sure where her neck ended and you might elongate her neck. So it's a tougher one to do. It was still designed to be a different kind of crop than the one that it is. Another option from the same shoot was this one. Again, designed to be very cinematic. And again is designed for widescreen TV version. So if I put this into it, now this one might work slightly better because there is slightly less at the top and the bottom to begin with, and so we lose a bit of ceiling, we lose a bit of seat. Maybe it doesn't matter. I don't want to take the tip of her fingers off, so I want to bring this down and actually probably almost just slightly above the center line, something like that. I think we can then actually pretty much get away with. And if we do that, actually I think that works fine. That's okay. We've not lost too much of, even though I've sort of built in a little slightly different flow for the side of it, we can just about get away with that. And I think that does look, in fact, actually having that elongated thing makes this look even more cinematic than it did before. And then if I was to put in the black lines above and below when posting that, I think that would look all right. So there are some of these photos which are kind of designed that way. And in a way, it has to be said, by and large, the photos that work best for these crops are ones where you've started thinking about it beforehand. Now, in 2 weeks' time, I'm setting a challenge today for, and I'll talk about this a bit more of this in a minute, a cinematic challenge for in 2 weeks' time. I want you to put in and submit your cinematic photos. Now, for that, so there might be some of you who want to go out and do this, but if you don't, I think you could still go off and raid the archives. Talk about that a bit more in a moment. Another one, for example, where now this one, which I was talking about last week, I think. So this is designed, now that's at that smaller of the cinematics, the 1 to 1.1851. So this is designed for cinematic ratio, but not the super wide screen. And you see, if I stick the super wide screen onto this one, what happens here is I can't fit in everything that I want. You can see that it's already cutting, it's cutting through a head and it's cutting through the ankles. If I want to get the heads in like that, I've lost part of the feet. If I really want to get the top of then I've lost nearly all the foot. If I want to get the feet in, I lose the face. So actually, if I kind of crop that, it's not really working. Again, so you do have to think about even a photo, this one was designed to be cinematic, but it was designed to be cinematic at the 1.185, not the 2.39 ratio. So the wider you go, the more you're losing from the top and the bottom. Okay, let's try another example. Now, again, if I say open this one here, so this poster done for the Wave Blues Band has it's got a narrative feel to it. I mean, this is the kind of thing I do. I create narrative images. But again, this is designed for computer screen. This has got that 16 by 9 element to it. And if I create this very similar to the last one, we're going to have a problem with the fact that not everything is going to fit in. That because Ken is standing higher than the rest, that if I kind of concentrate across here of what's going on the table, we'll actually end up cutting halfway through the middle of Ken's face. If I bring this up to bring Ken in completely, we've lost everything under the table. Now, it might just be people sitting down, but it still feels then we've not quite got the balance. I kind of want to have a little bit of the table underneath, in which case we're then cutting through the middle of Ken's forehead. Well, you can, and I suppose, if I was forced into this, then this is the crop I would do, and it sort of works again, but not really. I feel like I've lost a bit too much from the original design of the photo. So these kind of things can become really important. Anything which has got height or a height imbalance or a height change between one part of the photo and another isn't necessarily going to work so well when you crop it. Now, if we take this other one, which I was showing you a couple of weeks ago, which is this one was designed to be as widescreen as you want. Now, this is done to the 1.8, but actually, I don't even have to, I could do that, and I could go really widescreen if I wanted. Could even do something like that. And that still works fine. The design of this photo, because it doesn't have huge amounts on the top and the bottom, works perfectly well. Sometimes, I mean, if anybody's been watching my Instagram posts, there are certain ones where it can change it. So this was much more of a kind of slightly more standard shot. Is this a if I go to image size, and if I was to make that 1,000, yeah, this is 1,000 by 1,500. So this photo here is exactly your kind of standard 2x3 or 1 to 1.5 kind of photo. But if I then take this one, so this is Andrew Livingston. He's a tailor from across the road. I've done a previous Have I done one? Can't remember whether I've done one on him before. I think I have. Anyway, I did a whole set of photos for him, but we've got the tailor at work. Now, the full screen, we've got a real sense of the shop, the back of the shop where he's in, where we've got the whole table and everything else. Now, we're not going to fit all that in. And if I take in the full head, then we end up losing some of the stuff going down here. So what I will actually do is crop part way through his head. I won't, not the edge of the hairline, but between the hairline and the top of the head. And then, if I crop that there, it changes the feel of it. Now that actually does look, I think, does look quite cinematic. It's a different mood and feel. Even though it's the same shot, changing the crop has given it that more cinematic feel. You can kind of feel, you can imagine yourself sitting in a movie theatre with this scene on the screen, and it wouldn't feel out of place. And that in turn has a different feel to the idea of seeing this, which is very photographic. And this is really where I'm trying to come from, is that notion that the crop can change the mood and feel of a thing. And because you're missing bits out, you then have to start thinking about the narrative. So, one of the things I'm always banging on about, let me just close a couple of those there, that is narrative in photography. And the narrative being the notion of what's the story. Now, the story doesn't have to be War and Peace. The story can be the most fleeting of moods or thoughts or sensations, but there's got to be something. And the other thing about narrative is, especially, well, if you think cinematic tends to happen through time, right? Cinema is a moving, is a it's a two-dimensional, it's a three-dimensional, but not in the traditional sense. It's two dimensions physically, but it's a but we also use the time dimension. You watch a movie through time. So the ones that quite often work best are ones which have a feel of something came before it, something's going to happen after it. Okay? Now, you can still play with other images, but if you're trying to get if you do just a cinematic image of a flower all on its own, it's maybe less likely to work because the flower itself doesn't feel like it's going anywhere, unless you're doing some kind of time-stop, time-lapse animation or something where you're watching the flower go from bud to bloom to wilt. So this then becomes a kind of another aspect to it. Now, quite often these cinematic ratios suit some of my photography well because I'm already thinking that. I'm already trying to create images which look like they have a narrative to them. Or a sense of movement through time. Now, I was going to see a couple of other comments here. Rosemary said, are there standard crops for cutting off parts of the head? You mentioned not through the hairline. Yeah, okay, well, that's a good point. I think if you are cropping, generally speaking, you are cropping bits and pieces. You don't want to be cropping, first of all, elbows. Don't crop at the elbow. Crop either at the mid-arm or at the forearm. Don't crop through the knees. Crop through the thighs, crop through the calves. So where there are joints, don't crop through the neck. Crop through the chest. Or, and again, with the forehead, don't go at the hairline and don't go at the brow. Go at the middle of the forehead. Okay? So what you're trying to do if you're cropping through a body part is you don't want a body part where there is the limb or an actual kind of, like a hairline or a brow or directly in line with the top of the shirt or something like that, or the wrist. These things just look odd because the brain will fill in the gaps. So you will extend out naturally. If you see a bit of sleeve, your brain will extend out a bit of sleeve. So if you've cut on the sleeve, the person looking at it will extend the sleeve rather than necessarily slot a hand in. Whereas if you've cut it mid-arm, they will know that there's a hand the other side of it. So that's your key thing, is that you don't cut through elbows or joints. And you also, so that thing with the hair, then you can go through the middle of the forehead, but you don't go at the hairline and you don't go at the eyebrows. So hope that makes sense. Maggie says you really demonstrate how the cinematic crop enhances the narrative. I'm glad that's coming across. Rosemary says, agreed, Maggie, plus also the discussion about how to evaluate if something is narrative or not is very helpful. That's useful. To which Maggie says, it's also interesting to think how much of our experience of cinema has influenced our notion of story. Well, that's very true as well. That notion of the kind of what comes next. I mean, you can play around. Let me try and find a couple. I mean, you can have a little bit of fun. I mean, I don't know. I mean, let's say we take... let's take a cup of coffee, okay? So in this case, so we've got a cup of coffee. What if I try and create something out of this? Now, again, the way this particular picture is designed is we've got the coffee in the lower half and we've got the back of the cafe in the background. And so it's a photo of two halves. The cup sits in the middle. It's got a very specific photographic design. It doesn't look particularly cinematic. If I wanted to create it cinematic, what would I do? So I put that ratio in and I bring it down. I don't want to cut through the middle of the coffee because then that coffee's not going to quite look right. I think I would actually have to bring it down to here, or maybe just up a fraction, little bit of gap underneath there, because I also don't want to cut the top of the chairs too close. I need a kind of slight bit of gap down there and a slight bit of orange there. And then if I was to crop that, we then have a hint of the background as well. And that's another thing that very often works with that notion of cinematic, is that sense of something more going on. So we have the coffee here, but there's a hint of something going on in the background. The background is out of focus, slightly different light. The shadows and reflections on the table. There's a yellowish kind of golden background, but we've got a slightly more bluish bit in the foreground. There's a little pencil here. This is going back to COVID when we had to write out our phone numbers in a cafe just in case we needed to be track and traced. So that in a sense actually doesn't look too bad, because a cup of coffee has a sense of anticipation, especially because there's coffee in it. It's not an empty coffee cup which is just left on the table and could sit there forever. This coffee cup has coffee in it, so you're expecting it to be drunk. And there's a hint of people behind in the background, so there's a sense of movement. So actually, if you're not into people photography, then are there situations whereby you can create something looking a bit cinematic without people? Another one, let's say pizza, right? Now, a straightforward flat down from above pizza wouldn't work. Now, this pizza, though, has a slice in the process of being taken out of it. Now, if I take this then, what I need to do is reduce the opacity for that. I want to make sure that this is really about the pizza itself. So I'll come to something like that. So whereas the coffee cup, I was moving most of the top and just keeping part of the bottom. In this case, I can actually remove, sorry, not that one, that one. Remove most of the bottom of it, because the real action, the real narrative in this is that slice of pizza here. And so in a way, that's kind of, to be honest though, it's not a particularly interesting photo. I don't know that you're necessarily getting anywhere. But you can play around as well. Even say something like a street scene. If we take something like this. So in this case, we've got this person here is obviously been handed somebody's phone and said, could you photograph me with my bunny? Probably, I could have been St. Paul's Cathedral across the river in the background. So this is a kind of a street photo. There's a particular colour scheme going on where we've got, the pink bunny and then a kind of reflection in the jacket of the guy there. But yeah, street scenes can sometimes lend themselves quite well to that cinematic sense, because we're often, there's that sense of bustling, that sense of movement. And again, so if I take this now, if I do that and I kind of start to become slightly aware of the fact that there's a lot of space on the back here. Now, we've also got this guy here. I either need to be above his head or I need to be cutting between his ear and his head. But it feels slightly less balanced. So I'm going to actually bring that in a bit. But if I bring that in, not like that. If I grab that, you'll see the whole thing shrinks. So we get even less with the top and bottom. But in a way, I kind of need a little bit more of that. But I don't need all that gap on the side. So having done that, I now need to kind of consider how far up and down I need to go to get the balance. And like I say, I don't want to just tip the top of his hat, but I also don't want to tip the top of his head. So I'm going to kind of come just a tiny bit of gap above his head, still comfortably through above his hat, still comfortably through his head. And now I think if I was to do that, let's see what that looks like. Now I think that works okay. Now we have that, so that does feel quite cinematic. And I think if you're into street photography, there's a real potential here for getting really quite interesting cinematic scenes out of something like that. Now, other things are where you can start raiding your holiday snaps. Now, certain photos will work better than others. And again, where you tend to be... so this one, for example, went to Morocco and camel riding in the desert. Hey, how much fun was that? Absolute tourist thing to do. Now, if we take a photo like this one, now this is completely unedited, right? So I've got sky above, I've got camels below. I've taken this photo on the camel. So before you go, it doesn't look quite balanced, right, Kim? Congratulate me on the fact that this camel is sort of going about all over the place, and I'm desperately clinging on with one hand, with my camera, with the other, trying to get the shot. But let's shove in this widescreen ratio here and see what I can get out of it, because actually I think there's real potential. And so we do something like that, and now actually with this, the real story is the back of the camel. I want a bit of the sky, I want a bit of the desert, but now I think really I want to get something like this. And again, I've got to be careful where I cut the camel. I don't want to cut the camel through the middle of the ears or something like that. So I'll give the camel a little bit of a neck and something like that, I think. So bring that down to there and that up to there. And I think we've got something a bit more interesting. Now, this might then in turn require something slightly more edited. So what I might decide to do is take the curves and brighten it up a bit. In fact, actually, I'll tell you what I will also do with this. I'll go for the hue saturation and desaturate it a bit. And then between desaturating, in fact, I'm going to take it down to a kind of mid there, something like that. And then curves, brighten that out a little bit. We kind of go into this almost, yeah, now we're kind of playing with color grading in a way. And that creates a different kind of mood. This has now got that almost post-apocalyptic or that really hard sun, that kind of desert wasteland feel that the original photo doesn't, because actually the original photo, the sand here is very deep orange because it had in fact been storms the night before. If you look deep in here, you can see all the pits from where the raindrops have been hitting into the sand and the fresh tracks of the camel hooves. But if we go back to here and then we add in these kind of feel, there we can play around with that notion of cinematic as well, in terms of, you know, just creating a particular genre of movie. So, you know, it's not just a case of you can crop, but you can then play with your color grading, your light, your brightness, your contrast, all your other editing aspects become really important. Okay, so a couple more comments here. What have we got? Rosemary says, thanks, Kim. Helpful summary so I can remember. Good. Meg says, what type of material is he cutting? Oh, that's for making a suit. So he's making a suit, so he's got whichever kind of, I don't know exactly what the suit was made of, but he was making a suit. So that's the material used for that. Rosemary says, diagonals coming in from the corner of the street scene are effective. Yeah, so playing around with where the diagonals are, but I mean, there's other things. So another one, for example, sometimes what you've got to do is you've got to look to see where is the story. So let's say we take this one. So again, completely unedited. We've got a market scene here, again taken in Morocco. Now, there's quite a lot of different things going on here. The first thing I'll do actually is it's quite dark. Let me just filter, camera raw filter, so we can see a little bit more. I'll auto that, actually maybe bring the shadows up a little bit more so we've got a better sense of that, and maybe to add a little touch of clarity, something. So we've now got this picture. where is the story in this? And this is where I think the fun comes in, to be honest, is you can start tracking and creating where you move your thing around. Now, we can go the full width, something like that, and go, well, okay, there's a bit of a story down, there's the whole pile of fruit, that's not really giving us anything. We really want to be up with the people. So this then sort of becomes sort of slightly more interesting, but something's going funny with the computer here. Whereabouts do we want to crop with this? So maybe we want to do that, or maybe we will want to, no, not that. Like I say, hold on a sec. There's something going on here which isn't quite right. Okay, this might crash in a moment. It's done that once or twice to me before while I've been playing around with that. But okay, let's just pull that into there and pull that into there. So, and that's not bad, you know, that's not a bad shot. But what I really wanted to do was, if we come back to here and we go Control T, is to explore where else there might be stories. You know, is there a story, for example, going on over here? There's this person here, happens to be looking at the camera. Or are we looking more at a story, something that's happening up in the corner where we've got things going on, but we've got this lad here. We could drop this down, include a bit more of this lad, or do we want sort of this lad and a bit more of the fruit and the vegetables then cutting through a head over there? So maybe we've got something like that. You know, pull that over there, something like that. And then, again, we could crop that in. And that gives us a slightly different narrative, or, you know, depending on how we're... The point being with all this is that you can chop and change and move around and find the story within. And this is where I think the real fun of that idea of cinematic photography can be. Now, like I said, if you don't do people, if you don't do street photography, other options can be landscape. You can go for a bit of landscape. If let's say we take something like, let's take a sunset. This in itself, again, it's kind of big sky, big, so I can, now, if I just take that, we could do something like that. That creates quite a panoramic. Or I might decide to, again, move in closer and just decide where's the... Actually make a little bit more of this sunset here and just the edge of the rocks. Something like that. Yeah, I'll pull that out. No, actually take that in a bit more, I think. And then... But you see, you're hearing me go, up a bit, down a bit, left a bit, right a bit, okay? And this is where I think it becomes a really useful thing for you to train your eye, train your compositional eye. Because, like I said, what you can overlay, you create this little white sheet and overlay it and then expand it and shrink it. And you can keep kind of playing around, move it around the screen until it feels right. And the more you do this, the more of a feel you're going to get for it. And so something like this now has that quite panoramic sense. But even though it's a still image, we know sunset, we know this light is changing, we know the scene is changing. So I think you can kind of get away with that as well. So this is really where I wanted to be with this notion of cinematic, is crop ratios. And what I will do is I will leave the crop ratios in the comments somewhere, or certainly when I set the challenge, I'll put them into the YouTube video that I set up. Actually, for anybody who, I'll tell you what I will do, for anybody who's watching just now, where am I? I'll copy that and I will just paste these into the comments. Now, if you happen to be watching this back on the recording, please allow for the fact that for up to 24 hours after this is recorded, the comments don't appear. And then the whole thing appears again. So, but I will drop that into the comments. And what you should see now, anybody who's reading the comments, is it says the cinema ratios are the 1 to 1.851 and the 1 to 2.391. And then widescreen TV computer is 19 by 20, which is a 16 by 9 ratio, which is 1 to 1.778. So basically, if you use 1,000 pixels and then 1,851 or 2,391 or 1,778 to 1,000, those are the ratios you need. But anybody got any problems, zap me an email, I can explain them again. But it's that notion that the wider, the bigger the number compared to the height, the wider it's becoming. So that, if you're going for that notion of cinematic, then cinematic, you're looking for this wider screen, this more letterbox kind of feel. That's one part of it. But the other part is that you're still thinking narrative, okay? You're still thinking story. You're still thinking what... And so every other thing that we've ever talked about in photography, your rules of composition, your rules of light, your rules of the ideas of leading lines, your idea of color grading or black and white, how your eye travels through the image is really important, okay? And that notion of what might have happened just before, what might happen just after. Is there a sense of something's just happened? Is there an anticipation of something about to happen? Is there a combination of each? And I think if you're going for cinematic, ideally you're thinking of that moment in time where something has happened before or is going to happen afterwards, and this is a moment that's in between either, or following something that's happened or anticipating something that's about to happen. Now, if you're in a street scenes are bustling all the time. If you're doing a kind of portraiture action thing, the tailor is in the process of cutting. The street scene, the guy is in the process of taking the photo of the girl with the bunny. If the car scene with the two women in the car, you've got a conversation is seeming to happen. The sunset, the sun is about to move. Even the pizza is about to be taken out of the tray. The coffee is about to be drunk. Okay, so there is potential here to play around with that idea. A cinematic doesn't necessarily have to be about people. So with all that in mind, okay, I'm now going to set you the cinematic challenge, and I'm giving you 2 weeks. Today is the 2nd of July, so the 16th of July we're going to have the cinema challenge. So ideally before that, hopefully try and get your images to me before the Friday the 14th of July. If you've already got an image you want to put in, you can put it in this week. If you want to go away and play, raid your archives, go through your old photos, find interesting holiday snaps or photos from your garden or photos from the street down the road, or really just raid your archives and go, is there something here that would look good cinematic? Drop it into your photo editing, play around with that ratio and see how that ratio fits on different photos. And I think it's not, there's fun to be had, but there's also a tremendous learning process because you have to find the story, because quite often our photos are designed to fill the screen. When you chop off the top and the bottom, that narrative can change, but that doesn't necessarily mean it gets worse. Sometimes you can enhance a particular aspect of the narrative of the photo by removing these other elements. Hope that all makes sense. I think it's going to be a really fun, interesting, stretching, teaching, learning exercise to be able to do this. So I want as many of you as possible. I want you to find an image, just the one image each, and then submit them to me. Now, you can either put them in the Facebook group. We have the Facebook group, Kim Ayres Photography, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, or you can email me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. Send me your image, tell me a little bit about the image, and tell me any interesting little anecdotes about or difficulties you might have had creating it, or fun, or bits of interest. And then in 2 weeks' time, we'll go through the photos and hopefully we'll inspire everybody, because that's part of the point of these challenges. It's as well as what can I create here to put into the challenge, it's what is everybody else doing? because everybody else will have a different idea of approaching this challenge, and that in turn will inspire us to go off and try our other things. So I really hope you will take the time to put an image in for that. Tell your friends about it as well. Maybe use it as an excuse. If you know anybody who's ever done a bit of a narrative, or you're kind of quite impressed with their photos, get them involved as well. Okay, a couple of comments here. Rosemary says, where is the story? Excellent question to lodge in our brains even before we pick up our cameras as we're framing and then fine tune at the computer. That's true. I'm always saying, where's the story? And I think when you're trying to create a cinematic thing, it becomes even more so. Okay, John says, so I'm struggling a bit, but what's the pixel count on the cinema ratio, please? Well, directly above your comment there, I've just put the actual end pixel count will depend on the size of your image, but you're talking about the ratio, so that if your image was 1000 high, then your ratio across, if it's cinematic, would be 1851, or it would be 2391. So try and go for one of those ratios. If all else fails, I will still happily accept the kind of widescreen TV thing, which is the 1000 high to 1778 across. But that would also mean if it was 2000, then it would be double whatever 1778 is, so 3520, whatever. But it's about that ratio of height to width. So hope that makes sense, John. Right, okay. So, little reminder that if you happen to find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, then you can support them with buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. Excuse me. Right, I was chatting away. The throat has completely dried out here. Okay, so a little bit of time left. What I want to do now is I'm going to move on to the critique section. Next week I will be there'll be a space for a couple more options for critique. If you're interested in getting your feedback, send me your images for feedback. So yes, we've had two people today sent. Oh, it's not today. They sent them in earlier in the week, because that's the other thing. If you are going to send me an image for feedback, please try and get it in a few days in advance of the podcast, so that I've got time to really look through it. And again, tell me about the photo. Tell me what your sticking point is, and what kind of feedback it is you're hoping for, because not everybody's looking for the same feedback. Right, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to turn to Sandra, I think. So Sandra sent in this photo, and she said, I took this photo of Kev, my partner, in a rustic log cabin and cropped it in the first attached photo. Is that this one? Yes, I think that's. And and then says, but someone in PhotoCrowd commented that they would crop it in closer. So I did another black and white version closer in. So then after that, she cropped in to this, with the curly dead ivy removed. Now, regarding the black and white version, I have another couple of questions. Do you regard it as a low-key photo? And as I've entered this into a competition on PhotoCrowd, and would you keep the overall exposure so dark? I've had a couple of comments about my photos being too dark. I appreciate that this is a little contradiction, as low-key photos are meant to be dark. I also attached the original as well. So, okay, to address that point of is it too dark? Yes, it's too dark. And the thing here is, let me open this in Photoshop. Now, you're right, a low point of a low-key photo as opposed to a high-key photo. Let me just close a couple of these before Photoshop decides it's just got too many things going on it and decides it's going to crash. Yeah, how have I managed to keep so many of these open? Okay, let's just go with this one. Now, where the trick is going to come in is your histogram. If we go to levels, if I click on levels here, look down here on the right at the histogram, and what we can see is that it's all over on the left, which means it's all in the darks, and there's massive gap on the right. Now, a low-key photo does tend to be shaped such that the histogram is mostly over on the left. A high-key photo tends to be shaped so that most of the histogram is over on the right. So most of the shades are light or dark. Now, what's happened here? Photoshop's just crashed on me. Let me just actually briefly double check that you're still here. Yes, I think you're still here. So I'm just going to have to open up Photoshop again. Yeah, it was just clearly uncomfortable with what was going on. Now it's recovering a whole bunch of photos. Right, where do we go? Let's go back here and reopen Sandra's photo in Photoshop. Okay, so back into here. So where was I? Levels. Right, so a low-key photo is mostly dark, but it doesn't mean that there isn't any light in it. We still need to see the light. So if I take this bit here and I drag this slider to the right, then what we can see is the whole thing gets lighter. And by the time I get to here, it's considerably lighter. Now, what we're wanting, the thing is we want to make the full range, use of the full range of what's available to us with our light and dark. We're a full tonal range. Let's just, again, drag this over here a little bit so I don't interfere with it. Now, what I might do is bring this over here so we can see more of Kev that's going on here. Now, maybe it's a bit too dark, so, sorry, a bit too bright in the shadows. So I can use the mask on the levels, and perhaps what I would do is just darken down the window side of it, something like that, and maybe do it slightly more, a bit more neatly or something, but just to give you a sense of that. But the point is with this is that we're trying to lighten up Kev so that we can actually see him. Without lightening it up, Kev might be in there, but he's dark, he's too dark, and so you kind of need to make sure that you've got he is lit up enough. The other thing is that this is overall very dark. And I'm also not told there's a lot of space up here where, I mean, you've gone with that idea of cropping close. It feels in a way you've missed. But if part of it's the cabin, is it a cabin? Is it about Kev? Let's open up your original and just take a look at this. And what we've got here, interestingly, is like a second window. And part of me tends to, and there's something that's really interesting. We've got the ivy hanging down, we've got bits of wood here, but where's the story? Is the story about the cabin and there happens to be somebody sitting in here? Or is the story about Kev inside there reading looking at the cabin? And actually, what if we were to take that landscape or cinematic? If we were to go a bit more cinematic, then there's a slight imbalance because we've got a bit too much here. And what I would really want to do, say we take something like that. We've now got Kev in here. I kind of want to have more over on the right, but we would need a bit more of the other window. Now, if I just do content aware fill, I don't know whether that will actually work. Probably not. What you might have done though is say you'd had a bit more over on this side, something like that. And then, now, you would take the time to blend it all. But all I'm really saying is actually maybe take the photo sideways and get in the two windows. And then what you've got is you've got the contrast of the fact that you have, you've got Kev in one window and you don't have anything in the other window. And then at this point, if we take that, drag it into Photoshop, and tell you what, let's just say bring up the shadows. Okay, maybe play with the clarity, something like that. We do need to still bring up the exposure a bit so we can see Kev that's in here, something like that. Now, and then if you want to go black and white, that's fine. Desaturate it. These outer walls are then just a bit too bright, so again what we would do is just maybe take the curves to bring them down, but what we're wanting to do is keep Kev brighter in here, maybe a little bit of a patch of light coming through here, but primarily we're wanting to make sure that Kev stays light. And something like that I think becomes a bit interesting, where what you're doing then is taking the notion of, if you've got two windows, one window nothing's happening, the other window you've got somebody in it, and that kind of creates a bit of a narrative in itself. Alternatively, if we go back to the original photo, I quite like, this is also quite interesting as well, where you've got all these other bits. Now, at this point, maybe you come in here, something like that. Where are we taking Kev? Well, let's put him into that rule of thirds bottom corner there, something like that. But again, whether you're going black and white or not, you do need to have him brighter. And so we would have that, but then you would darken down the outside like we did before. So I think really that's the kind of direction you probably want to go in, Sandra, is, low key isn't about everything being too dark. You still want the tonal range. It means most of it's in the dark, but you don't want to have that great big gap over in your histogram. Grab the slider and slide it across. So I hope that makes sense to you there, Sandra. But thank you for sending that in. Okay, the other one then is Robert. So Robert sent in this photo, and he said, this is the next photo of the one I sent you last week. Some of you may remember last week that he sent in a picture of a woman walking with a partner. But she's glancing straight at the camera. And actually what he goes on to say is that couple walked in the way while I was trying to get this one. So this is where it's actually behind the other photo. It's a bit dark when I edit it and overall looks a bit overcooked. I'm not certain about the crop as well. I think the story is about the kid playing on a pay scooter. I'm just not certain that I'm capturing it properly. Okay, so I can see what you're going for here, Robert. So what we've got is we've got this kid and he's playing on the scooter. We've got people walking across in the background, and we've got a bit of shadow here as well. So it seems to have the elements, but you're right, it's not necessarily grabbing us in the way that it might. So if Robert sent in the original as well, so if I just open that in Photoshop for a moment, and we can see then that it's a much bigger photo with more of a scene going on. Now, the boy himself doesn't stand out against everything else. It's a very busy background, so that's why you came in. But there is part of me, again, I kind of want to go widthways with this. Right now, I know we lose the shadow, but bear with me. We come in here, there's still not enough. I want to get in closer. It is about this boy. Come in here, and we get in a little bit closer. And this is starting to give me something. Now, he's very much in the middle. We maybe want to... We don't need all of that. We're wanting him. We don't need all this gap to the side. I do still quite like having some feet and legs in the background, which indicate, because then you're creating that story of the fact that you have legs there, but he's on a scooter here. But we're wanting to try and bring that up a little bit, give us a little bit of width, just trying to find that optimal point, which I think is something like this. Now we've got this as our crop. I think this is where we then can play a little bit with the editing. So I'll duplicate that, take that into Camera Raw. So I'll do the auto, that kind of helps a bit. So we're taking the highlights down, so we're trying to get a bit more detail back out of that. He is still lost in the shadow a bit. The shadows have come up. Maybe bring that up a little bit more. We maybe want to go for a little bit of vignetting, just to kind of darken down those corners, because we don't really need too much there. We're trying to bring attention to him. And then we maybe want to play around with the contrast. We contrast it slightly there, but actually let's go for the clarity and then boost that and give it that little bit more texture here, like that. And now I think we're making more of a feature of him. Now, but I still kind of want to brighten him up a little bit. So what I might be wanting to do, let's say I went to curves or something, bring the curves up, but I'm only wanting him. So I'll fill that back in with black, and then painting in white, just brighten him up a little bit so that he's catching our attention that little bit more. And I think this is where we're starting. If I wanted to darken down the background a bit more, I might take these curves, drag this down a little bit, and do exactly the opposite, where I'm now going to change that to black and then lighter, allow him to... Now, At this point, it's getting, the edges are very obvious, okay? So you would need to go in and do a proper bit of masking around it, but I just kind of loosely do that. But if we take those two, group them together, you can see the difference between getting him to stand out. And that's also after we've gone from the original photo. But now you've got something like this, we've got him standing out. You might actually, for that matter, whilst we've darkened down the top bit, maybe just bring, well, maybe if I go to something like 50% opacity, just bring some of these little legs back in at the top there, just to kind of re-emphasize the fact that there's legs being compared to the scooter and the narrative travel there. And then that way, I think this is kind of really where the narrative is, Robert. And the fact that he's facing to the left, having that little bit more space along the left, I think that, you know, other things would have worked better. You know, if these shadows had been a bit longer, if these people had been a bit further down, there's other options, but you're grabbing what you can at the time. From that original photo, I think really here's where your story is, but you do have to play with it to kind of get the light and dark. But you've also got to be careful that where you've darkened with curves and stuff like that, there isn't like an obvious line, because as soon as there's an obvious line, you see it, people view it, and then what they're noticing is they're noticing the edit, they're not noticing the story. And so this is why your editing has to be really careful. If people are noticing the edit, you've lost them. Editing needs to be done in such a way that it's invisible. People aren't thinking about it unless you specifically draw their attention to it. So I hope that makes sense. Right, okay. A couple more comments here. Oh, Rosemary saying, very interesting building and gentlemen, Sandra. And Sandra saying, thanks for the feedback and the different cropping and lighting objections. I will have another go at editing this. Excellent. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end of that section. So reminder then that next week we are going to be looking at 2 weeks time we are having the cinematic challenge. Okay, now next week what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you some photos that only a few people at Spring Fling last month have seen. A set of photos I did with Annalise and Phil that I'm really proud of. They also have a cinematic feel to them. Very different from some of the other stuff that I've shown you. So I'm quite excited to show you that. But I will also have a couple of slots for feedback as well. So make sure you get your images into me as soon as you can if you're wanting feedback on anything. But the primary thing now is that in 2 weeks' time we're talking about the cinematic challenge. I'm hoping I've inspired you enough here so that so you can play around with the crops. When I sort of start setting up and everything I will leave these cinematic ratios for you. But actually, to be honest, it's dead easy. If you're ever unsure, type into Google cinematic crop ratios, okay? Cinema crop ratios, but cinematic crop ratios will give you, up comes on the first page, there will be these things of the one to 1.851 and the other to 2.391, or whichever one it was. So that gives you your ratio. Once you've got that ratio, you can then dig out old photos and you can see where you can create some really interesting, what's going to look cinematic, what's going to be enhanced. That's the point. What photo is going to be enhanced by that ratio? Do you have photos in your folder? Is there something you'd like to go out and try? Like I say, I think street scenes can be really interesting, but if that's not your thing, some landscapes can be pretty good. Still life, slightly more difficult. Food, you need to have something. It's about this idea of anticipation, of something's about to happen, or something has just happened, or you're at an in-between stage of things happening. The whole point of cinema is that it runs through time. And that notion of what's the story, what's the mood, what's the feel, is it about anticipation, is it about movement of colour, potential movement in people, in objects, in time, of the sun or shadows. These are the kind of things to explore, and guaranteed if you do this you will learn in the process of doing it. You will not, the chances of you finding your first image, this all working out perfectly, is very, very slim. That's okay, embrace that. In fact, if your first one works perfectly, Don't stop there. Go, oh, that's a lucky bonus. I'll park that. Let's see what else I can find. Okay? I want you to go through the process of trying to find several, find ones that really excite you. And then when you've got the best version of it, put it in for this cinematic challenge. And then we'll have a whole load of fun in 2 weeks' time. So I hope that all makes sense. I really hope you're going to join in. So that's pretty much us. Robert's got a last comment saying, thanks for the ideas. I will revisit after the cinematic challenge. I'm looking forward to it. Excellent. Okay. So that's us. Thank you very much to Robert and to Sandra for sending in the images. I hope you've all really enjoyed that notion of playing around what makes a cinematic image. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.